We are thrilled to have you here in our fundraising masterclass series. Thank you as you're all coming in. We always have a great number of people that come in late, but we're so happy to have you here and the work that you're doing to learn about fundraising and help improve the work that you're doing. In this session today, Navigating the Complexities of Philanthropy, we have amazing speakers that will be joining us to share their expertise and the work that they've been doing over a long history of working in the field of fundraising and philanthropy. We would love as you introduce yourself in the chat. It is our favorite thing to do with Catalyst is to put in the chat your name, your organization. If you have a LinkedIn, you feel free to share your LinkedIn and where you're calling in from in the world. And also, we'd be happy to also see, what are you looking forward to in the session? If you already have a question, put it in the chat because we will be having a long period of time for Q&A. Some of the housekeeping things is if you're able to be on camera, we absolutely love you to be on camera for our speakers so they can see your beautiful faces, but we also know it's not always possible with Wi-Fi issues in different parts of the world and what's going on in your life right now. So we appreciate you being able to join us here today. As I get started, let me welcome you all again. Everybody should be joining in to this new fundraising masterclass and introduce our speakers today. We are so blessed to have what I call the dream team of fundraising. And if you've had the pleasure of meeting Tim and Chitra Henstad, you will know that these two truly are an amazing team working together. Chitra is a senior philanthropy officer at Landesa, and so they both moved back to India, and they've been working there. Landesa works a lot with land rights and human trafficking, refugee resettlement, etc. It's been around for a very long time. Interestingly enough, that Tim actually helped found that organization. So they have a long history with Landesa. And she's run her own social venture as well in Washington. And she's worked with Juster Ventures International and just has this really amazing long history of working in this space. You will have such a delight to have Chitra here today. And she's one of those warm and welcoming people that no matter where you are at the moment that you're in the room with her, you feel special. The other speaker today is her amazing co-partner in crime, but also in life, Tim Henstad. He's the vice chair of the Chandler Foundation that's based in the US. And he was the first CEO of that organization. The work that he's done with Chandler has focused on shared prosperity. They had an amazing magazine they did. They work on high trust societies and individuals with opportunities to flourish. And he did co-found and was CEO of Landesa. And it was the #1 human rights NGO organization in the world. So it's such a win. Tim actually was a Skoll awardee. So he has a long history with Skoll Foundation, Schwab Foundation, and we are just so thrilled to have both of them here today. So without further ado, I will pass it off to our dream team speakers. And as we said, feel free to put in the chat your name, your organization, where you're calling in from. And if you have questions along the way, put them in the chat and we will answer them after they give you their 10 tips on fundraising. So off to you two.
Okay, I'm going to start, and it's so great to be here. Debbie, thank you so much for inviting us. And my tip #1 is know your product, know your audience, and know your niche. I don't think Debbie knows this, but I started my career in advertising and marketing. And often when I think about the nonprofit sector, I think about it in marketing terms. And each nonprofit is different and unique. And your mission or the bulk of what you do is what I call the product. And that product is what you're going to be marketing to your donors. And I know it might sound a little crass, but just stick with me on this. So get to know your product inside and out. What are the key ingredients of your product? Meaning, what are your programmatic pillars? Why was your organization created? What need or problem does your organization address? Who does your organization serve? Once you know your product, you have to determine what makes your organization unique. Why should someone invest in your organization as opposed to the estimated 10 million organizations in the world right now, nonprofits? When you figure this out, you'll know what your niche is. And finally, get to know your target audience. Who are the people that are supporting your organization? What motivates them to give? And how do they feel when they contribute to your cause? If you don't know the answers to those questions, you should do a short survey with your existing donors and find out. It really helps you to find more donors who are like-minded. Let me give you an example with Landesa, the organization that I'm working for right now. So our product is rural poverty alleviation in developing countries. We do this through verticals like the Center for Women's Land Rights, Climate Change Action, Global Advocacy, and on the ground land and policy reforms. There are thousands of organizations that have the same goal of poverty alleviation. In fact, many of you might be doing that. But our method of poverty alleviation is grounded in the belief that a core component to prosperity and opportunity is having secure legal land rights. Our niche to poverty alleviation, therefore, is secure land rights through policy, law, and systems change. We're also not a service provider, but we're a systems change organization. That also makes Landesa unique. We're a group of attorneys and social scientists who work on changing the laws and systems to benefit the rural poor in terms of secure land tenure. Knowing your donor audience is also important. And at Landesa, our donor audience has been high net worth individuals who have the ability to give at least six-figure gifts, foundations, corporate foundations, and government contracts. Because we're a systems change organization, we're a bit more difficult to understand and explain to retail donors. By retail donors, I mean donors who give smaller amounts of money or are monthly donors or give a one-time gift. These type of donors are usually attracted to service delivery organizations. So if you're one of those, if you work with children or you work with education or healthcare, you might be looking for a service for retail donors. So if you know how your audience works and how they think, you can target and segment your marketing materials to match your donors. So know your product, know your niche, and know your audience. So I'm going to send it over to my esteemed colleague, Tim Hanstead, after this. Go ahead, Tim.
Citra. I could listen to her all day, and sometimes do. It's great to see a lot of friends, old and new, on the screen here. So thanks for joining us today, and thanks, Debbie, for the invitation. My first point is to center your fundraising around an organizational strategy. So if you're finding that donors don't understand what you really want to do, or if you're finding that you're spending too much time on fundraising or spending too much time on making reports to donors, it may be because you have not developed, communicated, and then used a coherent organizational strategy at the center of your fundraising. So my experience as a leader of a social purpose organization, and most of my career was in that. It was on the grant seeking side. It's just the last 5 years or so that I've worked on the grant providing side. But the experience on both sides suggests to me that organizations who have coherent organizational strategies and then center their fundraising around those strategies are more successful at raising money generally. And importantly, they're particularly more successful at raising core support. That is that really important flexible money that gives you, the organizations, the opportunity to do what you really want to do, rather than the project restricted funding that may not be at the core of what you want to do. So what is this coherent organizational strategy? What does it consist of? In my opinion, it should include, importantly, a theory of change and related intended impact. And I think they're going to share, Karen's going to share in the chat, one of the resources this is from the Bridgebane Group that was really useful for me, going back 20 years and more, on how to create a theory of change and intended impact, and how to integrate that, or actually have it be at the center of your organizational strategy. Then, of course, you need a summary of your interventions and approaches, your programs, what Chitra mentioned in her first point. You also need a description of how you will measure success, how you're going to measure progress, what are the list of metrics and milestones, organizational indicators. And fourth, and these aren't the only components, but I think these should always be there, you need some description of how you're going to learn going forward. How are we going to learn from your experience and adapt? Because the best strategy in the world has to be adaptable. So that strategy should include those things. The time frame for strategies, people often ask me, in my opinion, I think they should range from 3 years to 5 years. Once you develop that strategy, the important part of my point really is center your fundraising strategy, your fundraising around the strategy. So in communicating with funders, after you've understood the funders' priorities, share your strategy as part of the exploration with the funder to determine whether your priorities overlap with their funders. A really good strategy, by the way, should inform what you don't do, even more so than what you do. What do you say no to? And on this point, there's a great 15-minute video out there on YouTube by Rakesh Rajani, someone I worked with at Co-Impact. He's now the leader of Just Systems. He's led many social purpose organizations, and he presents the basic argument of why developing this coherent strategy is so important, and centering your fundraising around it. You present the strategy to funders. If they're not interested in your strategy, can't get on board with your vision, move on to others. Over to you, Chitra.
Okay, so this is going to sound counterintuitive. Do not center donors in your fundraising. Why do I say this? During my career, I've been taught through many trainings, seminars, classes, that we should center donors in our fundraising. It makes a lot of sense to a lot of people because donors are so crucial to the functioning of our nonprofits, right? Like all of us on this call, what do we want? We want more money. And, if we had more money, we could do the work that we're called to do. But as I've grown older and walked with people on the margins, I've learned that the donors are not the heroes. The true heroes are not the staff, but the people who participate in our programs. They're the true heroes of their own stories. If we elevate donors, if we create urgent appeals for funding by presenting the people that we serve as less than, helpless, and without agency, we minimize them and their stories, okay? The refugee organization that I led for 5 years, we learned that emphasizing mutually transformative relationships was a better way to operate. This is the idea that we invite our donors into relationships that they might learn from the people participating in our programs and vice versa. There's often a representation of those we serve in a deficit mindset, We need to emphasize that every human has assets that are valuable to our thriving. Donors have the opportunity to participate in this thriving by lending their resources to uplift people. Telling positive stories of resilient people is not only encouraging to donors, but also to our participants. I had a policy that all of our marketing materials, our brochures, anything that we put out should center our participants and make them feel good about themselves. If any of our participants picked up one of our brochures, they should walk away feeling uplifted and feeling good about themselves. So in our fundraising, in your fundraising, center your participants and then include your donors as a vital part of their journey. But don't make your donors the hero. All right, back to you, Tim.
Great advice. My next point is seek to understand before being understood. And for those of you familiar with Stephen Covey's best-selling book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, you will have seen this before. It's habit number 5 of his 7. And this important habit has so many important applications in today's world, but including for fundraising. When I moved from being a grant seeker to leading a grant giving organization, I started realizing that many of the grant seekers at a first time meeting would start the meeting by quickly launching into describing their organization, sometimes in great detail, and often racing through what was always, of course, limited time in a meeting to tell me as much as possible during that meeting. Other grant seekers, however, started the meetings by asking probing questions about our foundation's priorities. That is, after having done their desk research on the foundation, they would go further to confirm that the information on the website was up to date, or ask more nuanced questions if the information on the website wasn't articulate enough, which maybe often it wasn't. So they'd really show that they're trying to understand the foundation's priorities. Now, why is this important? It's not important to make the donor feel good. Thinking of Chitra's last point, it's important because it served the grant seekers really well, because when they later went into trying to help me understand their organizations and its priorities, they could do a better job of zeroing into or highlighting or asking even more probing questions about where those overlapping priorities of their organization with our foundation were. And so being on the grant provider side of the discussion helped me to realize that I could have done a much better job of this when I was a grant seeker. Seeking first to truly understand a funder's priorities, which are often changing, as you know. I can tell you from the inside, they're often changing, or they may not be well articulated on the website. So don't just assume that you know them, even if you've done good desk research. Seek first to truly understand before rushing to make your own pitch. Can serve you very, very well. Over to you, Chitra.
Okay, this next point is redundant. Relationships. Because the reason I'm saying it 3 times is because relationship building is key for fundraising. I've worked raising money in the US, all over Asia now. And one thing I found that in the US, we have a much more robust system of fundraising. That's why a lot of us in the developing world, or always in the global south, are looking to the global north for funding, right? But there they also have a well-established system, rules and culture around fundraising. And in order to participate, we simply need to follow the rules and we have access, right? But even in that, their relationships and networks, they're also involved. So it's who you know, oftentimes, more than what you know. So if you do receive money from one foundation, one of the key things, and I'm sure a lot of you do this already, is to ask, in addition to the funding, ask, could they write a letter of recommendation for you? And send that letter of recommendation to 3 other like-minded foundations that they work with to introduce you to them. Because that, for me, has opened more doors than anything else. Just ask them, to have that be one of your standard asks to any foundation that gives you money. Would you be willing to introduce me to X, Y, or Z? Especially if you've already researched them and you haven't been able to get through to them. So these introductions will really open doors for you. In Asia, fundraising is all about knowing and respecting the culture and establishing deep relationships. And it's also embedded in building trust. And oftentimes in the global South, if we're raising money, it's more about building trust. And again, one way to do that is if you get one donor, ask them to introduce you to others. Also, accolades and things like prizes you've won. Like for Landesa, we were named one of the top 10 NGOs for the last 7 years running, and we were just named the top human rights organization in the world. We've received the Hilton Humanitarian Prize. So I have a list of all of those accolades that I listed on one page, and I send that along with a letter of introduction in Asia, just to say we have credibility. We're not just we're not just going to take your money and run away with it. We're established, we've been around for a while. And if you have anybody like a donor that's really well known, like if you got something from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example, ask if they could write a letter, just a short, not a letter, but just a short referral for you, just a note to say, we love this organization. We've supported it for 10 years because they have incredible impact. I mean, whatever it is. What I used to do, honestly, is write those for the foundation and say, here's a draft. Would you sign off on it? Make it as easy as you can for them to give you that recommendation. And then finally, Asian donors, like other donors, make sure that you're the real deal, have impact, have numbers, make sure that you can back up what you say and have really good data to back that up to show your impact. When we establish relationships, we need to remember that we have something to offer donors. A lot of us that have been in this sector for a long time, like I've done this work for 30 years and walked with marginalized people, we often, when we come up against donors that are high net worth, we don't feel like we have a lot to offer them. But what I've learned over the years is that most of the donors that have a lot of money don't have access to the people and the community that we have. They don't have access to the stories, to the field that we get to go to. Let's face it, those of us in this sector are super lucky. We get to see lives change. We get to interact with amazing, resilient, courageous people every day. I mean, you get to access this inspiration. So don't forget that a banker or a lawyer or a doctor that you meet may never get to see this kind of transformation in their day-to-day life. You can bring that to them. That's what we have to offer. So when we create real relationships with donors that are mutually transformative, this levels the playing field and it allows us to get to know your donor as people with many facets to their lives. So when we ask for money, that's just one of the few components to the relationship. Some of you that are in the field and you have access to these stories, these things don't have to be really polished. One of our fundraisers, I just gave him, I said, go out into the field like summer camp. Just go out like you're a field reporter and do like a 2-minute video and say, today we're at summer camp and these kids are learning learning about environmental science today in our garden. And then he would send those out to like 20 donors that he was trying to get to know. Those kind of little, just little interactions with your donors mean a lot. We did that with foundations too. Hey, so-and-so foundation, I was just at the summer camp that you helped fund this summer, and here's what these kids are doing today. We would never show their faces, we'd just show their hands, like if they were doing an art project or if they were out in the garden doing something, and we'd send that to them in real time. Those kind of tiny little interactions with your donors makes a huge difference. That's how you create relationship. It's not like those big reports you send. Those don't make as much of an impact as those little tiny bits of, it's just like in a real relationship with anybody you're in with a friend. It's those little moments that create the glue that holds you together. So really, really invest in the relationships, whether it's your donors, individual, or your foundations. Invest in those relationships. All right, Tim.
Thanks. So important. So, many of my most important lessons, including all of the ones I'm covering today, they came more from mistakes and failures than they did from successes. So, I should have said this at the beginning, but I don't, and I think Trisha would say the same too. We're presenting based on not that we've done these things well, but often didn't do them well and have learned from that. And by the way, Trisha said 30 years, it's been closer to 40 years. So this is one of those where I learned from more of my failings. So early on in my career as a leader of a social purpose organization, as a grant seeker, my fundraising perspective was that of 1, generate a list of funder prospects, 2, turn those funder prospects into funders one at a time, and then 3, once you've done that with 1, then move back to the list and try to turn another prospect and into a funder. And it was only after time that I recognized that my greatest prospects for increased grant revenue or for getting additional or larger grants was from my existing funders. They were better prospects than those on the list that I hadn't gotten money from. So another way of putting this is time spent stewarding existing donors, existing funding partners, will have greater returns than the time chasing new prospects. And this is perhaps a corollary to the point that Chitra just made about relationships. And the corollary is stewardship. Spend substantial time stewarding your existing funders. Get to know them. Chitra said, treat them as humans, as partners who share your goals and want to see them realized. Don't treat them as cash machines. Because doing that stewardship, doing so will pay dividends, and not just in terms of increasing your likelihood of obtaining more financial resources, but in other ways as well. And that other ways as well is a point I'll return to in a bit. Children, over to you.
Sorry. So the next point is find a, oops. Okay, I'll go to that one. I had a different one queued up. Fundraising is a team sport. So if you're an executive director on this call or you're on a fundraising team, you know it can often be lonely being responsible for funding your organization. I remember when I founded early on when I founded an organization, I remember not paying my own salary so I could make payroll for the rest of the team. I remember those days, and it's a lot of responsibility. But one of the things I've learned over the years is that it's a team sport. It's not just for the executive director. Executive directors should be spending anywhere from 50 to 80% of their time raising funds. But the the entire organization should be involved in funding the organization. So what we did at World Relief, one of the refugee org that I ran, we trained every one of our employees to be ambassadors of the work. So they had a mandatory elevator pitch training that I made them all go through, where they had to explain why they were, what does World Relief do, and why am I passionate about this work? And we had the entire staff, you know, almost 100 people in there, and they all had to do this elevator pitch, and we filmed them. And then the rest of the staff gave them feedback on how they could get better at the elevator pitch. And we also had, I had all the employees write down 5 people in their network that they could introduce to our organization. And first everybody was grumbling, I don't know 5 rich people, you know, they said. And so I would say, okay, let's think through your school network, your worship, the place where you worship, that network. Let's think about where you worked prior to this organization. So I had them think through all of their networks, and they were surprised that they came up with more than 5 people that they could invite to an event or a gala. And at the galas, another thing that you can do is to make sure that your whole team is involved. I would have somebody from the staff sit at every table at our gala with a button that said, ask me what I do. And so instead of just having people from, you know, just people sitting together that don't know each other, you have a staff member, a program person sitting there that can infuse the conversation with stories about what they're seeing every day in their work, that inspiration I was talking about. Often our program people are our best storytellers. And when if you're an executive director, I used to have a standing meeting every week with a different program person. And I would ask them, tell me a story. What did you see today? Tell me about who you saw that had, that was touched by one of our programs. And if you have those stories in your back pocket, especially if you're a fundraiser and you're meeting with donors or a foundation, those stories are invaluable. Storytelling is the best way to touch people's hearts. I mean, you need your statistics, but also have a story to back it up. You know, you can say, oh, 80% of our, of the men that go through our program don't go back to prison. But then let me tell you a story about John. You know, I just met with John and here was his story. That seals the deal. So make sure as the head of an organization that you're in touch with your program people, because we often discount them, but they're our best storytellers. And make it a team sport, make it fun for everyone to be part of it. Tim, back to you.
Great. Over the many years that I was leading Landesa as its CEO, I learned that the best donors, the most valuable donors, were not necessarily the ones that provided the most financial resources. So the point here is donors can provide more than money. Chitra already touched on this point in one of her earlier ones, which probably just shows that I didn't coordinate with her enough. But I'm going to get into this a bit more. Donors can provide value to organizations in so many ways beyond providing money. And over the years, I experienced donors adding incredible value by serving as references, as Chitra already mentioned, for other donor prospects, making introductions to other donor prospects, hosting a fundraising or fundraising events, serving as board members, providing strategic advice and feedback, providing access to pro bono or discounted professional services, providing executive coaching, providing meeting space, providing connections, access to journalists or media opportunities, and so many other things. And importantly, this applies not only to your existing donors, your existing funding partners, but to prospective donors. So I encourage you to approach meetings with donor prospects with 2 goals in mind. The first goal is to try to identify if there's a meaningful likelihood for achieving a financial partnership. That, of course, may sound obvious, but that should be goal number one. And it really involves identifying whether you and the donor prospect have overlapping priorities, as I touched on earlier. And identify this as early as you can, because it's if you're going to get to a no, and for most donor prospects, you will get to a no. That's just the reality of it. Get to a no quickly. But once you get to that no, don't stop. So then move to that second goal. The second goal being, are there any other ways in which this donor prospect might be able to help you? Can they suggest other donors that might be interested in funding your organization now that they've learned more about your organization? Can they provide introductions to donor prospects that you already have, as Chitra mentioned before, that donors often have a much easier time getting access to other donors than the fund seekers do. Can they provide feedback on your org strategy or on your pitch, et cetera, et cetera? There's so many things. One of my biggest frustrations as a grant seeker was going into meetings and trying to, as I mentioned earlier, trying to achieve that first goal and coming away from a meeting just not having clarity as to, is there going to be a meaningful prospect for funding here? So do try to nail that down, but don't stop there. Get to a yes or to a no quickly and move to how might this donor prospect help me beyond just the financial resources they have. Over to you.
Okay, my final point for tonight is find a champion for your work. And what do I mean by a champion? It's anybody that can speak for your work as well as you can. You should really prep them and tell them the story of your work. But over the years, many people have been ambassadors for the mission of the organizations that I've served. When I was founded an organization that assisted formerly incarcerated men find employment, we asked one of our NBA basketball players on our local NBA team if he would be comfortable coming onto our board. And it was a huge, I mean, you've got to understand, we were just a tiny little organization at the time, but we dreamt big. We said, we just wanted this guy on our board. And he lived in a really ritzy part of town. We were in, a tough part of town, and he used to drive his big old Mercedes into this part of town. He's like, Chitra, can't you just have it somewhere else? But we wanted him to come and see the where we were. We were on top of a gospel mission thrift store, and we had mice running through the office. We wanted him to see where we were. And he got so engaged with what he would come and talk to the guys. And we found out that not only was he going to bring excitement and name recognition to our little organization, but he had the same story as a lot of the guys that we served. He grew up in poverty and he didn't have a lot of opportunities. And he had so much in common with these guys, but he had incredible talent, athletic talent. And that's how he was able to escape poverty, right? But he agreed to headline our fundraiser. The Sonics, it was the Supersonics, Seattle Supersonics, they went to the playoffs that year. So he got a lot of his buddies to sign basketballs and basketball shoes for our auction. He got the announcer for the Sonics to be our MC. And we made so much money that year because he was just all in being on the board. So find somebody. And then later when I was running the refugee org, we didn't want to use celebrities. We thought, let's find people that have gone through our program and who are doing amazing things, giving back to the community. So we created something called the Courage Award, and we gave it every year to a refugee that had gone through our program and was now doing amazing things in the community. And it exemplified our vision statement, which was every refugee welcomed by community, rooted in community, and then empowered for community. So that was like, people just love that. Like our donors just love to hear from people that had actually been through the cycle. And then finally at Landesa, we invite, so again, for each organization, it's got to be, your champion has to fit, right? So for Landesa, we invite government champions that have seen the impact of what Landesa has done. But then don't be afraid to think outside the box. So for Landesa, we haven't launched this yet, but this is a crazy collab that's coming up, and you're going to see a lot more about it. But you guys have heard of Bridgerton, right? The lady that wrote the Bridgerton novels is going to be Landesa's champion for the next year. She was our neighbor, was Tim and I's neighbor for 20 some years. And so when she blew up and Netflix bought her novels, I said, you know what? All of those women in your novels, Julie, that had to get married off, it's because they couldn't inherit land. And that was what was happening in Regency era England is happening right now in our world all over. And women can't inherit land. So would you consider being our champion? And she's been talking about us on Good Morning America and all these places, even on Shondaland, we got a shout out. So we've never been able to access retail donors, as I said before, but what we're gonna do is run a monthly campaign on, she has 800,000 followers on her social media. So we're gonna try to get retail donors through this collab with Bridgerton. So we're gonna have a Bridgerton tea. So all of this is coming up. So think outside the box. You might, who do you know? Who's in your network? And don't be limited, like be creative, okay? Think outside the box. So that's just a fun story that's coming up. You'll see a lot more of it in the next year. That's it for me. I think back to Tim.
Okay, last one. Diversifying funding sources is probably not the answer. So many leaders of aspiring nonprofits state that a top funding objective is diversification. And it seems sensible. When government funding stalls, why not try to raise money from individual donations? When corporate money dries up, why not try to replace it with foundation grants? And isn't having a wide array of funding sources a good way to mitigate the risk of losing any single source of money? So diversification may seem like a good idea, but in practice, most of the organizations that have been most successful in their fundraising in recent decades, this is US-based organization, did so by concentrating on one type of funding source, not by diversifying across several sources of funding. So this was based on a study that the Bridgespan Group did of 110 successful high-growth US organizations. And of the 110, roughly 90% had a single dominant source of funding. It was government, or it was individual donations or corporate gifts, et cetera, et cetera. And on average, that dominant funding source accounted for just over 90% of the organization's total funding.
Wow.
So we're going to put this study in the chat. It's a few years old now, but I still think really important. I've tried to encourage Bridgespan to update it. And in fact, there were 3 really important findings from the study that could be relevant for your organization. These organizations, and they were chosen from organizations that had grown really fast and been very successful in fundraising. Three things. One, they had developed, as I mentioned, funding in one concentrated source category rather than across diverse sources. Second, They found a funding source category that was a natural match to their mission and beneficiaries. This is something that Chitra touched upon earlier. And third, they then built a professional organization and structure around that funding model. Now, Brisbane went on to conduct in-depth interviews with 21 leaders from those organizations. And this led to even more insights. They found that more than 2/3 of them had not only a dominant source of funding, but also a specialization within that area. For example, not just government funding, but also state government funding, not just individual donations, but also small individual donations, not just corporate donations, but also in-kind corporate donations. And also, and importantly, and this also could be relevant for your organizations, only a few of those 21 that went into deeper interviews knew from the start where they would find their most prominent funding sources. That is, they didn't start concentrating on one. They often were uncertain about which source was most promising. So they did have some diversification at the beginning, kind of testing the different sources. But as those organizations pursued their growth, they realized which sources of funding seemed most promising. And then they were willing to concentrate their efforts on that source, recruiting people, creating organizations, creating capacity that would best pursue that funding source. So consider this study and its findings as you think about whether and how to diversify your funding sources. And that study is now in the chat. And we're to the end.
Great.
Debbie,
These 10 tips are wonderful. And I love the storytelling in between it. Obviously, Bridgerton is just amazing for the land rights. So wonderful, Chitra. So our questions in the chat, feel free to keep adding them. But Molly had the first one. Any tips for the storytelling and that building of relationships you talked about, Chitra, with donors? And who are some, how do you do this when most of your interactions with donors are online?
That's a great question. And because of technology, I mean, Tim and I are much older, and we've been doing this for, like Tim said, like almost 40 years. When I first started, it was all face-to-face, or I would write notes, but even if your donor interaction is online, there's great ways to use technology. Like I said, sending small videos from your participants. Like we used to do stories from refugees and we would pay, like we actually, if we use stories from refugees, we had like, it's one thing, if you're gonna use your constituents to do any type of work for you, pay them, don't just take their time for granted. But we would send little videos, thank you videos to donors to say, hey, I heard that, these are for larger gifts, heard that you gave money to this. It's people like me, and kind of just told a very brief portion of their story. Because of your funding, I was able to go to ESL class, and now I just got a job with the employment team. And we would send those little videos out. Another thing that I did a lot of, and this is something I think is underrated, I would get, when I'd see cards on sale, to write handwritten cards. I mean, people love getting written, like actual mail. I mean, you know how much junk mail you get. So if you get a nice handwritten note, and even foundations love this, because I actually worked at a foundation for a couple of years, and when one of our donors or grantees would write a handwritten note and send it to us, it made so much of a difference than when we got just a regular old letter. The other thing that we used to do to remember birthdays, or like for foundations, for Christmas time, we would use some of the kids' artwork and make little note cards out of it and send that to our foundation lead and just say, thank you so much for supporting us this year. our kids thoroughly enjoyed the summer academy that you provided for. Here's just a note of thanks, you know, here's just a gift. So using technology to communicate online really works well. So, you know, I don't know if that answered your question, but Tim, you might have some other tips.
Yeah, I think that's great, Chitra. I would just add that, okay, this may sound like a no-brainer, but you'd be amazed at how many people don't do it. If you're on a Zoom call, turn your video on. I mean, I'm not talking about for this call necessarily, but
Oh, I'm
particularly
talking about now.
having a call with a funder. It goes back to Chitra's point about relationships. People at the end give to people. And this is true whether it's an institutional donor or not. So you need to, if you're talking to, whether it's a corporation, whether it's a representative from a government funder, whether it's a foundation funder, you need to connect with that person. And connecting with that, so that's another thing. Start meetings with funders if you haven't met them before, or funder representatives, with introductions, personal introductions, and find things within those introductions or based on your desk research of the people where you can connect with them as people. Look for ways to connect as human beings, because if you don't connect as human beings, even with institutional funders, your chances of getting funding are next to zero. So, and it's possible to do that over Zoom. Of course, it's much better in person, but you know, as Chitra was saying, Zoom is much better than the old telephone ways, which is what we had to do from the beginning. So yeah, connect with people.
Great, wonderful. And Sarah Jane put in the chat, for those of you that couldn't see it, handwritten notes are so powerful, notes of gratitude. It is a long-standing thing. Send out those notes, even if you have a board member or somebody send it from the other country. The handwritten notes just matter so much. Sanaz had a question earlier about sharing a story about, you know, a potential failure that you had in fundraising, and you thought, oh gosh, this is just going to fail, but it turned into a success. Can you briefly share a story that you can think of as how could you turn around a donor that you thought it wasn't going in the right direction?
You're talking about an individual donor or an event, or?
Could be individual donor. She didn't specify.
Tim, you have one right off the top of your head? I've got so many. I'm just trying to think through.
Yeah, well, I'll just tell you, I had a, this maybe goes to reading people. I had a meeting with a foundation rep one time, this is earlier in my career, where and this was a senior person, I thought he actually fell asleep during the meeting, which seemed like, you know, not a good thing, and thinking, well, there's no prospect of funding here. But I actually read it wrong, and I don't know, they just listened while closing their eyes or something like that. So but that's just one specific example of sometimes from the first meeting, if you're just reading either, particularly if it's nonverbal cues. I mean, if the funder tells you, I really don't see a match here and I don't see a prospect, you should take them at their word. But if you're just, you know, reading nonverbal cues or other things, don't give up right away. At least that was a lesson from that one. I came away from it thinking, no way, and they ended up being a huge donor.
Great. And let me keep on just because we're short on time here, is just that starting point, Chitra, you touched on this a little bit about identifying those potential new donors and kind of that initial work there. Can you just give a couple, like 2 quick tips about what do you do early on when you're trying to vet this is a good donor for us?
Oh, figuring out if it's a good donor for us. Yeah, I mean, I had a series of questions that I asked donors when I met with them. And I just say, what are your funding priorities? Like what gets you excited? What gets you up in the morning? What is like really an exciting thing for you to give to? And if they said something like healthcare, like health is my thing. And here I'm representing a refugee organization. We are not going to do healthcare, and I'd say, tell me more about that. Why are you so passionate about it? If they completely don't have anything in common with you, what I would do is say, hey, I know 3 different organizations are doing amazing work in healthcare in our community, and I'd be happy to introduce you to them. But would you have any friends that would be interested in refugees, So that's kind of like the trade-off. I'm happy that money goes out, right? Whether it comes to me or to somebody else, as long as it gets into the community, into the communities that I care about, I'm going to try to help them out. And people really appreciate that. It's like, you don't want to try to force a square peg into a round hole or whatever. That's not going to be a long-term donor. But if you can point them in the right direction, they're very appreciative, and they'll give you, they'll in kind, they'll give you something in return. And I saw somebody else asked about new donors. Was that another question I saw?
Yeah. Yeah, and we're running out of time, but if you
Okay.
can give that
A
1
quick-
minute, that'd be great.
Yeah, a quick thing for new donors is have a current donor do what we used to call a party in a box. And that was in a home. They would open their home, provide food, and we had a prepared kind of just a 20-minute program that we put on in their home, and they would invite their friends, and all we had to do was show up and do the program. This was maybe like 15 people, 10 to 15 people. And we had one of our refugees come with us, tell their story. I talked about the organization, and that was it. It was basically a fundraiser. It was not a fundraiser. And then we would follow up with those 15 people and say, would you like to meet with Chitra one-on-one after that? So that was just a prospecting, party in a box. And I could tell you more about it, but we don't have time. Yeah.
No, so thank you so much. We do want to launch our poll quickly. We'd love to get your feedback. So just please take a couple of seconds, minutes to fill out this poll and let us now know how the session went. And so there's 2 quick questions, but we'd love to, if you share anything else about what worked well or some suggestions, we'd love to have that as well. We always get a great response from the attendees for the poll. So we'd love for you to do that. And the poll's going to stay up for a few moments. Upcoming opportunities, we have a new Medium platform for Catalyst. Drew Villamoria has one on social innovation and economy, and we have one that we posted that anyone can share an article that they would like us to post on our Medium site. So we'll put in the link to be able to do that. Upcoming series that we have is the Wellbeing series. It starts next week. We would love to have you join us for the Wellbeing series. And lastly, we wanted to share just to thank all the self-assessment tools. So there's a few donors that are in this call. And so the donors, we'd love to have you guys, take the self-assessment tool to see where you are on funding systems change. And let me, if everyone could go off on camera real quickly, and we're going to do a quick photo of everyone that's here. So and no worries about your hair or what have you, but we want to do a quick photo of everyone. And as you can see, the dream team is right next to each other. So we'll unpin ourselves and we'll do a quick photo if you're able to go on camera with us. But we'd love to do that with this really wonderful team, dream team, to be able to share, have everyone on camera. We got to unpin them. There you go. And we'll take a quick photo there. So thank you for being off camera. And we made it. We've got 60 seconds left. 1 30-second response, Tim and Chitra. What is your last quick minute of advice for those people that are fundraising to be able to stick with it? So quick 30-second, you only get to give them one piece of advice.
don't get discouraged. You'll get 10 or 20 no's for every yes. That's normal.
And remember that you have something to offer. You're not bothering people by asking for money. You're giving them an opportunity to get involved in something that's greater than themselves. And the world needs that right now. So keep doing the amazing work you're doing.
Amazing. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We've got tips in the chat. We will follow up with the recording and other summary of what happened today, but thank you so much. Thank you, Chitra and Tim, and everybody unmute and say thank you to our speakers today as you go about the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
much.
Thank you
Bye.
so much.